Welcome to the Finance Lecture. What if the richest alumni network in American hard tech is not producing companies, but producing a new form of private sovereignty, trained to harvest every place where the state can no longer build fast enough to defend itself? And what if that is not a bug, not a conspiracy, not an accident, but the logical terminal expression of a country that decided 40 years ago to let its public capacity rot, while telling itself the story that private markets would always fill the gap, and is now discovering in real time that the people who fill that gap do not serve the republic, they price it? The public thinks the SpaceX alumni phenomenon is a startup story. It is not. It is a power transfer story. The deeper mechanism is this. SpaceX became an institutional refinery where a small number of people learned how to turn physical constraint, state panic, regulatory complexity, and procurement failure into private market instruments. They did not merely learn rockets. They learned how the modern American system pays for urgency after pretending for years that urgency does not exist. But even that does not capture the full strangeness of what is happening, because the transfer is not simply economic, it is epistemic, it is temporal. It is, in a sense, that will take this entire document to unpack, civilizational. The knowledge that left SpaceX in the skulls of its alumni is not technical knowledge in the way most people use that word. It is something closer to what the medieval guilds would have called mastery, except the craft being mastered is not metallurgy or stone cutting. The craft is the conversion of institutional incoherence into private order. The raw material is not iron. The raw material is the distance between what a government says it can do and what it actually can do. That distance is widening, and the people who learn to measure it with precision are now the most consequential economic actors in American industrial life. This is why the phenomenon feels different from PayPal, Google, Facebook, or the old Silicon Valley founder networks. Those networks were built around distribution, software, payments, advertising, and user behavior. The SpaceX network is built around something harder and more dangerous, the conversion of national deficiency into investable company formation. NASA's COTS structure helped prove a new procurement pattern. Private firms could receive milestone-based support to develop orbital transport capability, rather than simply operate as traditional contractors. SpaceX's own public material describes Falcon 9 reuse as a way to refly the most expensive parts of the rocket and lower access costs. The U.S. Space Force's National Security Space Launch, Phase 3. Lane. 2 awards show how much strategic demand now flows through private launch providers for high-risk national payloads. That matters because the state did not just buy services, it created a training environment. And some of the people who passed through that environment left carrying something more valuable than credentials. They carried the grammar of sovereign demand. Let me say what I mean by that phrase, because it is the key to everything that follows. The grammar of sovereign demand is not a metaphor. It is a literal cognitive structure. It is the ability to parse, in real time, the difference between what a government agency says it needs, what it actually needs, what it is allowed to admit it needs, what it will eventually be forced to fund, and what the political environment will permit it to purchase from a private actor. Those 5 things are almost never the same. The gap between them is where fortunes are built. And the people who can read that gap fluently, who can hear the 5 competing signals simultaneously and construct a company-shaped object that satisfies all of them just enough, those people are operating with a kind of intelligence that has no clean analog in consumer technology, enterprise software, or traditional venture capital. They are not founders in the Silicon Valley sense. They are sovereign interpreters, and the country is now producing them at scale. So look, the easy version is that SpaceX produced founders because it was intense, technical, and close to Elon Musk. Fine, that explanation works at a cocktail party. It does not explain the money. The actual answer is stranger. SpaceX trained people to see government failure before government publicly admits failure exists. That is the first asymmetry. Most founders look for customers. These founders look for bottlenecks that will become customers once the old system embarrasses itself badly enough. That is a different skill. A normal founder asks, who wants this product? A strategic founder asks, which institution will be forced to buy this capability when its current supplier, current doctrine, or current budget model, or current regulatory fiction breaks? That is not marketing. That is state psychology. And let me be precise about what state psychology means in this context, because it matters enormously, and almost no one talks about it with sufficient granularity. A state does not decide to buy things the way a consumer does. A consumer sees a product, evaluates it against desire and budget, and purchases or does not. A state operates through a completely different decision architecture. A state buys things when the intersection of threat perception, bureaucratic incentive, congressional authorization, budgetary allocation, program management bandwidth, legal permissibility, political optics, and interagency consensus reaches a threshold that triggers procurement action. Most people see that sentence and their eyes glaze over. The SpaceX alumni see it and understand that each node in that chain is a timing signal. They understand that threat perception can sit at the classified level for years before it migrates into a public document that investors can read. They understand that bureaucratic incentive means a specific person inside a specific office has a specific career reason to champion a specific capability at a specific moment. They understand that congressional authorization means a particular committee chair with a particular district interest needs to see a particular industrial story that maps onto a particular employment narrative. This is not cynicism. This is operational literacy. The old aerospace world taught people how to survive inside procurement. SpaceX taught people how to attack procurement from outside it while still being legible to it. That is a rare combination. Too much outsider energy and the state treats you like a toy. Too much insider fluency and you become another slow contractor with nicer branding. The alumni who matter are operating in the seam, not fully private, not fully public, not exactly defense contractor, not exactly startup founder, something else, a sovereign adjacent operator. And I mean this. That is where the wealth is. Not because these people are all geniuses. Some are not. The point is not individual brilliance. The point is institutional conditioning. They were trained inside a company where physics punished delusion, capital punished delay, government punished non-compliance, and the market rewarded proof. That combination filters people very differently than software does. Software lets you hide from reality longer. Hardware does not. A bad interface can be patched. A bad engine cycle cannot be flattered into working. A broken supply chain does not care about founder mystique. A failed launch turns strategy into debris. So the alumni effect is not they learned ambition. No, they learned contact with non-negotiable reality. That is becoming one of the scarcest skills in America. And this is worth pausing on because the scarcity itself is a structural phenomenon that requires explanation. Why is contact with non-negotiable reality scarce? It should not be. Reality is everywhere. Physics does not hide. Material constraints are not secret. The laws of thermodynamics are published. The answer is that American institutional life has spent decades constructing elaborate buffers between decision makers and physical consequence. Financialization buffers capital from production. Credentialism buffers authority from competence. Outsourcing buffers management from manufacturing. Litigation buffers design from deployment. Compliance buffers action from accountability. Each buffer was individually rational. Collectively, they created a civilization where the people who make the most consequential decisions are the people most insulated from the physical results of those decisions. SpaceX broke that insulation. Inside SpaceX, if your valve design failed, the rocket failed. If the rocket failed, the mission failed. If the mission failed, the contract was at risk. If the contract was at risk, the company was at risk. The causal chain between your Tuesday afternoon decision and the existential health of the enterprise was short, visible, and unforgiving. That is not normal in American corporate life. That is not normal in government. That is not normal in consulting, finance, law, or academia. It is barely normal in most of aerospace, where program timelines are long enough that consequences diffuse across decades and headcounts. So what SpaceX produced was not merely engineers who understood rockets. It produced humans who had been reconditioned to expect short feedback loops between decision and consequence in a world that has systematically lengthened those loops everywhere else. That reconditioning is the real product, and it is worth more than any patent. Every institution has a clock speed. Universities move at grant speed. Agencies move at review speed. Primes move at program speed. Venture firms move at fund cycle speed. Public markets move at narrative speed. SpaceX imposed a different clock on a sector that had become too comfortable moving slowly. That is the deeper violence, not disruption as branding, temporal violence. The firm changed the acceptable rhythm of aerospace execution. Once that happened, everyone else had to explain why they were slower. That is a brutal thing to do to an incumbent. Because old aerospace did not merely have high costs, it had a defended theory of slowness, safety, reliability, certification, requirements, process, review. Each term was partly real and partly protective camouflage. I am being slightly unfair, but only slightly. The insidious part is that slowness becomes self-justifying once enough people depend on it. A long program creates managers, consultants, compliance layers, subcontractors, reporting structures, budget offices, oversight rituals, and congressional constituencies. The delay stops being a problem. It becomes the income stream. Then a faster actor arrives and exposes the whole arrangement as less inevitable than advertised. That exposure is worth billions, but here is where the analysis needs to go deeper than most treatments allow. The clock speed advantage is not simply about moving fast. It is about the relationship between internal tempo and external crisis timing. This is the part that almost no one discusses, and it is the part that makes the SpaceX alumni pattern genuinely unprecedented in American economic history. Consider what happens when an external threat accelerates. A geopolitical rival demonstrates a new capability. A supply chain collapses. A satellite constellation is jammed. A hypersonic test succeeds. A critical mineral supply is embargoed. In each case, the state's demand signal shifts from routine to urgent. The budget conversation changes, the procurement timeline compresses, the acceptable risk threshold rises, the willingness to work with non-traditional vendors increases. Now ask, which companies benefit from that acceleration? Not the slow incumbents. Their internal clock speed cannot match the crisis clock. They are structurally unable to respond at the speed the moment demands. Their review processes, their subcontractor chains, their compliance architectures, their workforce planning, all of it was designed for a slower world. When the world speeds up, they become liabilities. The companies that benefit are the ones whose internal clock was already fast, the ones that were already operating at crisis speed before the crisis arrived, the ones that can produce a prototype while the incumbent is still scheduling a requirements review. This is not just a competitive advantage. It is a form of temporal arbitrage. Temporal arbitrage. Remember that phrase? It is the hidden engine of the entire SpaceX alumni economy. Here is how it works. The alumni leave SpaceX carrying an internal clock speed that was set by the most demanding industrial environment in modern American engineering. They enter adjacent markets where the incumbents operate at institutional speed, which is to say, slowly. The alumni build companies at SpaceX speed. The incumbents cannot match that speed. When the crisis arrives, and in modern America, the crisis always arrives, the fast company is already positioned. The slow company is still planning. The alumni are not predicting the future. They are pre-positioning for a future that is structurally inevitable. They know the crisis is coming because they saw from the inside how fragile the old systems actually are. They know the state will be forced to buy because they saw from the inside how little internal capacity the state actually has. They know the money will flow because they saw from the inside how the procurement system accelerates under pressure. So they are not merely starting companies. They are building temporal options. Each company is a bet that the clock of external crisis will eventually catch up to the clock of internal capability. And because American institutional decay is accelerating, because infrastructure is aging, supply chains are brittling, adversaries are advancing, and public capacity is eroding, those bets are paying off at an increasing rate. This is why SpaceX alumni are not just building companies. They are exporting a clock speed into adjacent markets: launch, hypersonics, mapping, industrial automation, rail logistics, remote sensing, orbital infrastructure, defense software, navigation, materials, manufacturing. The domain changes, the clock discipline travels, and capital follows the clock. Because investors know something most civilians do not know. The best company is not always the one with the best technology. It is often the one whose internal speed is closest to the speed of the coming crisis. That is the hidden formula. When the external world accelerates, slow incumbents become structurally short volatility. Fast operators become long volatility. SpaceX alumni are long volatility in physical form. And the volatility they are long on is not market volatility in the financial sense. It is institutional volatility. It is the volatility of a state that promised its citizens capabilities it can no longer deliver. It is the volatility of procurement systems designed for peacetime being forced to operate in contested environment conditions. It is the volatility of a regulatory architecture built for a world where America was the sole technological superpower, now confronting a world where that is no longer guaranteed. That volatility is the largest unpriced asset class in America, and the SpaceX alumni are the people who learned how to price it. There is a dimension of this phenomenon that rarely gets discussed because it makes people uncomfortable. The dimension is death, not metaphorical death, literal death. The possibility that a bad engineering decision will kill someone, that a valve fails and a crew is lost, that a stage separates incorrectly and a rocket becomes a bomb, that a heat shield delaminates and a vehicle disintegrates during re-entry. Software companies do not operate under this constraint. A bad software deployment might crash a server, it might lose data, it might briefly embarrass a company, but no one dies because a CSS property was set incorrectly. Rockets kill people when they fail. That fact, the proximity to lethal consequence, produces a completely different epistemological culture inside the organization. It produces what I'm going to call a body count filter, and it is one of the most important and least discussed elements of the SpaceX alumni advantage. The body count filter works like this. When the penalty for being wrong is catastrophic and irreversible, the organization cannot tolerate epistemic sloppiness. It cannot tolerate the kind of confident vagueness that works in consulting. It cannot tolerate the kind of optimistic projection that works in venture pitches. It cannot tolerate the kind of bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility that works in government. It needs people who actually know what they claim to know, not people who can argue persuasively. People who can be right under pressure when being wrong means someone does not come home. That filter eliminates an enormous number of otherwise talented people. Most smart people have never been tested against a constraint where the penalty for error is death. They have been tested against grades, against hiring committees, against promotion boards, against investor skepticism, against peer review. All of those are real tests. None of them are lethal tests. The SpaceX environment administered something close to a lethal test. Not because employees were personally at risk, most were not, but because the culture internalized the lethality of the system they were building. Every engineering review, every design decision, every manufacturing call was made in the shadow of the question, if we get this wrong, does someone die? That question changes how people think. It does not make them smarter in the IQ sense. It makes them more epistemically honest. It forces them to distinguish between what they believe and what they know. It forces them to distinguish between what the model predicts and what the hardware will actually do. It forces them to distinguish between the story they are telling their manager and the physical reality they are observing on the test stand. Those distinctions are collapsing elsewhere in American institutional life. In finance, the distinction between model and reality collapsed spectacularly in 2008 and is collapsing again in different instruments. In government, the distinction between policy and implementation has become so wide that entire programs exist primarily as announcements. In technology, the distinction between product vision and product capability has been stretched to the point where billion-dollar valuations are sustained by demos that do not represent production systems. SpaceX did not permit that stretch. And the people who survived that non-permission left carrying a form of cognitive discipline that is now extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. They know what knowing actually feels like. That sounds trivial. It is not. Most professionals in America operate in environments where knowing and performing knowing are indistinguishable, where the person who can articulate a confident answer in a meeting is treated identically to the person who actually has the answer, where rhetorical fluency substitutes for engineering certainty. The SpaceX alumni know the difference. They have felt the difference. They have watched the difference matter. And that experience, the experience of being in an environment where the distinction between knowing and performing knowing was enforced by physics, gave them a calibration that most of the professional class lacks. That calibration is a weapon. In a world full of people who sound certain, the person who actually is certain has an almost unfair advantage. In a world full of pitch decks that describe capability, the person who can demonstrate capability owns the room. In a world full of roadmaps that extend to 2030, the person who can deliver in 2025 controls the conversation. This is why investors trust SpaceX alumni disproportionately, not because of brand affinity, not because of the Elon association, because the body count filter means these alumni are less likely to be bullshitting. And in a venture market saturated with optimistic projection, the person who is not bullshitting is the person you want to back. Now, the public likes clean categories. Government is government, business is business, venture capital is risk capital, defense is defense, space is space. That is not how this works. Modern hard tech wealth is created when public need becomes private optionality. The state has the problem, the startup has the tempo, the investor has the risk appetite, the incumbent has the relationship, the regulator has the gate. The founder's job is to put all five into the same machine without getting crushed by any one of them. That machine is ugly. It does not look like the free market you get taught in introductory economics. It does not look like central planning either. It is a hybrid creature. Public fear, private equity, technical scarcity, legal permission, and narrative legitimacy all braided together. And this hybrid creature has a lineage that most people in technology are unaware of, because it requires knowing something about the history of state-private entanglement that American education deliberately obscures. The closest historical analog is not Silicon Valley. It is the British East India Company, not in its colonial violence, that is a different moral discussion, but in its structural architecture. The East India Company was a private entity that performed sovereign functions. It raised armies, it negotiated treaties, it administered territory, it collected taxes, it operated a judicial system. It was not a branch of the British state, but it exercised state power under a charter that blurred the boundary between commercial enterprise and sovereign authority. That blurring is happening again, not through colonial charters, but through procurement contracts, classified partnerships, infrastructure dependencies, and capability monopolies. Take national security space. The government cannot simply stop needing launch, satellite communications, orbital awareness, resilient navigation, and secure infrastructure. These are not optional luxuries. They sit inside military planning, intelligence collection, disaster response, logistics, and geopolitical signaling. SpaceX's Starshield product is explicitly presented as a secured satellite network for government entities, built from Starlink technology and launch capability for national security use. That means a private company can sit inside the nervous system of state capacity, not metaphorically, operationally. And once that happens, the old textbook distinction between vendor and state function begins to blur. This is the part people are not ready to think through. The state wants sovereign capability, but it increasingly buys that capability from private firms whose equity value rises because the state cannot generate the capability internally, so public weakness becomes private valuation. Then private valuation attracts talent, then talent leaves and creates adjacent firms, then the state buys from those firms too. A loop forms. State dependence produces private abundance. Private abundance produces more state dependence. The founders are not outside the system. They are spawned by the system's inability to repair itself. That is the sinister part. Not sinister because someone planned it in a dark room. Sinister because no one needs to plan it. The incentives are enough. And the incentives are self-reinforcing in ways that make the loop almost impossible to break. Consider the talent dimension. When the most capable engineers and operators see that they can earn 10 times more equity building a private defense company than they can earn working inside the government agency that buys from that company, the talent flows out of public service and into private enterprise. That talent drain weakens the government's internal capacity further, which increases its dependence on private vendors, which increases the equity value of private vendors, which attracts more talent away from government, which weakens internal capacity further. This is not a market failure in the traditional sense. The market is functioning exactly as designed. Prices are clearing, talent is flowing to its highest value use, capital is being allocated efficiently. The failure is deeper than the market. The failure is that the system that was supposed to maintain public capacity, the civil service, the national labs, the arsenals, the government engineering centers, has been hollowed out to the point where it cannot compete for the people it needs to do the work it is constitutionally obligated to perform. And the SpaceX alumni are not causing that hollowing. They are profiting from it, which is a different moral category than causing it, but it is not an innocent one either. People underestimate procurement because it looks boring. Forms, timelines, approvals, compliance, source selection, deliverables, milestones, audit trails. Nobody makes movies about this. But procurement is where sovereignty becomes cash flow. If you understand procurement, you understand how a state converts fear into payment. And that understanding is a form of power that is almost completely invisible to anyone who has not operated inside the system. Here is what most people do not understand about defense procurement. The system is not designed to buy the best product. It is designed to distribute accountability across enough decision makers that no single person can be blamed when something goes wrong. That is the primary design objective. Not efficiency, not speed, not innovation, blame distribution. Every form, every review, every milestone, every compliance check is a node in an accountability network. Each node exists so that when a senator asks why a program failed, the program manager can point to 7 layers of review that all signed off. The system does not optimize for outcome, it optimizes for defensibility. Once you understand that, you understand why the system is slow. It is slow because speed concentrates accountability. If you move fast and something breaks, there are fewer signatures between you and the blame. If you move slowly, you accumulate enough signatures that the blame becomes diffuse. Slowness is not a bug. It is an accountability dispersion mechanism. The SpaceX alumni understand this at an intuitive level that most outsiders never achieve. They watched it from inside the system. They saw how requirements were written not to describe what the government needed, but to describe what the government could defend having asked for. They saw how evaluation criteria were structured not to identify the best solution, but to create a paper trail that could survive a protest. They saw how timelines were set, not by engineering necessity, but by budget cycles, election cycles, and career cycles of the officials managing the program. That is why the phrase market size is often too primitive for this category. The better phrase is forced budget emergence. A market does not always exist. Sometimes it is born when the state runs out of excuses. And there is a taxonomy of excuses that the SpaceX alumni learned to read like a diagnostic instrument. When the government says, we are studying the problem, that means the problem is real, but no one has taken ownership. When the government says, we are developing requirements, that means someone has taken ownership, but has not yet secured funding. When the government says, we are conducting a competitive analysis, that means the funding is likely, but the political cover is not yet in place. When the government says, we are issuing a broad agency announcement, that means the political cover exists, but the technical risk is still perceived as high. When the government says, we are entering a sole source justification, that means the technical risk has been demonstrated away by someone. And the question is no longer whether to buy, but from whom. Each of those phrases is a timing signal. Each signal tells the educated listener how many months or years stand between the current moment and the moment when actual money will flow into an actual company. The SpaceX alumni learned to read those signals the way a bond trader reads yield curve inversions, not as static descriptions, but as dynamic indicators of future capital deployment. That is why some hard tech firms can raise large sums before ordinary revenue logic would justify it. Investors are not always buying current income. They are buying a future moment when the state's embarrassment becomes non-discretionary spending. That is procurement clairvoyance, and it is not magic. It is pattern recognition trained inside the only company in modern America where the full cycle, from congressional appropriation to launchpad, was visible to mid-level operators in compressed time. That full cycle visibility is the thing that cannot be replicated. You cannot get it from a textbook. You cannot get it from a think tank fellowship. You cannot get it from a consulting engagement. You can only get it from being inside an organization that actually receives government money, actually builds hardware, actually flies missions, and actually faces the consequences, commercial, reputational, and existential, of success and failure on a timeline short enough that you can see the entire causal chain before your memory of the early decisions fades. SpaceX was perhaps the only organization in 21st century America where that complete causal chain was visible. And the people who saw it left carrying a map of American institutional weakness that is more accurate, more detailed, and more actionable than anything produced by Rand, McKinsey, or the Government Accountability Office. That map is what they are building companies from, not technology. Maps.